welcome to the next in our series of videos about different aspects of horse health. This one's about worming and worm control in your horses. I thought it was important to talk about worming because there's a lot more to it than just using worming drugs, and the importance of worming management can't be overstated. So sit back and enjoy the video. The importance of worms in horses is quite obvious, not just from an emotional point of view, thinking that your horse has got parasites, but also from the potential problems that those parasites can cause your horse. And they can vary from very generalised signs such as ill thrift, depression, malaise, starey coat, to the sort of signs that you normally associate with worms, and they're things like weight loss, diarrhoea, colic, and in severe cases even death, although that's quite unusual. The types of worms that infect horses are quite varied. We obviously have the roundworms, which are things like the large red worms, which used to be a problem many years ago, and more recently they were almost disregarded. But it does seem to be becoming more of a problem at the moment. And then one of the largest problems for adult horses are the small red worms, or cythostomins. They are causing many severe problems because of the larval stage, which can almost hibernate inside the horse, and that can be a problem over the winter and then in the spring when they start to hatch out. As well as that, in younger horses, foals and yearlings, we have things like Parascus aquarum, which is a very large worm, which can be a very severe problem, like I say in foals particularly, where they can even block the intestine. Also, there are things like tapeworms, as I mentioned. They have been associated with certain sorts of colic and have a general control program which is different from the others. Also, a problem more recently has been pinworms. One of the difficulties with that is not always seen in the droppings. It lives around, or the adult lives around the anus and will often lay the eggs around the end of the anus, and sometimes a sellotape test to get worm eggs on the sellotape from around the anus is the only way of diagnosing it. More recently as well, we've had problems with liver fluke, and that again seems to be a problem in certain areas, in particularly wet areas with some horses. And one of the difficulties with that is being able to diagnose it, as the eggs of that are not always obvious in the droppings. Obviously things like bots, many people will have seen in the droppings as the small cigar-shaped structures that we can very easily identify. But the main thing with the worm control is not always relying on the wormers, the worming drugs that we use to control these. And the reason for that is that the worms are becoming increasingly cleverer, in that they are becoming more resistant to the different worming drugs. And at the moment there are only 3 different families of drugs that are available. And certainly some of those have been around for many years, and one of the groups called the benzimidazole wormers has been around since the 50s and 60s, and has a lot of resistance to it. Having said that, there is still a use for the drug, and it can be used, one of the main reasons in foals actually, because it will actually destroy the worms, whereas some of the other worming drugs will only paralyse them and allow the body to pass. A second group, which is the pyrantel type group, is the one that will mainly get rid of tapeworms. It can also do roundworms as well, but it's mainly used for tapeworm control. And then the final group is the ivermectin or moxidectin type wormers, which are the ones nowadays that seem to have the least resistance, but resistance is becoming more and more of a problem as time goes on. So having mentioned those, as I say, we don't just rely on the worming drugs, and the problem with just relying on those is that there are no new worming groups available, and eventually we would expect that the worms will develop a resistance to those drugs as well. So for the future it does present quite a large problem. Okay, so one of the most important things about using worming drugs is to get an accurate dose, and that's very important from the point of view of resistance, in that if an underdose is given, it won't kill off all the worms, yet they will be exposed to the drug and have the potential for developing resistance. So one of the best ways of doing this is to get a weight. There's several ways of doing this. One is with a weigh tape, which, as you may be aware, put it over the top there, making sure you've got the correct side. There's a side that is for ponies and a side for horses. Make sure that side is correct. And then a fairly accurate weight can be gained with this. Roughly in the area of the girth area, and we're getting roughly there about 511 kilos, which isn't bad. So we'll try him now. We're lucky enough to have a weight bridge as well as a weigh tape. So what we'll do is we'll pop him on the weigh bridge, and we're getting 516. So you can see there there's slightly larger, or slightly heavier should I say, than the weigh tape estimates, but it's only about 5 kilograms out, which is a fantastic margin of error really. And that is always something, if you're ever in any doubt about what amount of worming drug to use, always overestimate your horse's weight. And there is even an argument to say overestimate by 10 to 15%. So on a 500 kilogram horse, if you give enough for a 550 kilogram or a 575 kilogram, that's better than underdosing. Very, very important. So once you've gained an accurate weight for your horse, the important thing is what type of wormer to use, and really this is something that you need bespoke advice from your veterinary surgeon, because it is very important as to the timing of the wormer as regards the time of year, and which wormer you should use in that situation. Another good management practice to do is, after you've used a worming drug, particularly in the case of youngsters with Parascaris aquarum, the large roundworm that we were talking about before, is to keep them in for 3 days, or certainly keep them off the pasture for 3 days, because it is possible for those eggs to remain on the pasture at that time. All the other types of worms tend not to be a problem as regards this, and the keeping in is maybe not as important. But again, I must stress, getting bespoke advice, particularly with young horses, from your veterinary surgeon is extremely important. I can't overstate the importance of management strategies for worm control, and really they should be seen as a more important aspect than using worming drugs. First of all, we talk about fecal egg counts or worm counts. These are very important that you have them done properly by a professional, and ideally I would say your veterinary surgeon, and they will identify in most cases how many worms your horse has got. And although they're not always completely accurate, and there are some worms that you cannot pick up on a fecal egg count, they are an important part of it. One of the important ways of taking a poo sample is to make sure you have at least 3 fecal bowls and mix those together, so you've got about 10 grams of droppings, and that gives you a good mixture of the worms or the worm eggs that may be in those fecal bowls. That will then give you an idea of which horses on your yard will need to be wormed. And there is an argument to say that horses with only a very low level of worms or worm egg counts shouldn't necessarily be wormed, and only the ones with a very high count, maybe above 200 to 400 eggs per gram, should be the ones targeted with the wormers. As well as that, the grazing strategies are very important. And one of the important things with that is not having too much of a stocking density. So if you've got a lot of horses on a small piece of land, obviously there's a tendency then for them to graze the areas where the droppings are laid, which is obviously not good. They will then pick up further drop-ins. A way of getting around that is by regular poo picking, and once or twice a week poo picking will help remove most of the worms from the pasture, and will virtually eliminate in some cases any worms being passed on. As well as that, grazing with different species, so grazing with other ruminants such as sheep or goat or cattle will often help, as they will often eat the worm eggs from the horses that will pass through them and not harm them. So again, another important thing. As is the coordination of the worming, and that's really important, with everybody worming at the same time on a yard with the same program, and ideally again with the direction from the fecal egg count. What you tend to find is when the fecal egg counts are done, there may be about, there's a rule called the 80-20 rule, and what that generally means is that 80% of horses will have 20% of the worms. And that really means that it's only a very small percentage, the 20%, 1 in 5 horses, that will have or tend to have a high worm burden, and they're the ones that need to be targeted with the worming drugs. And ideally, if it's possible, they should be grazed together. Horses with higher counts should be grazed together. Interval worming of just doing it on a regular basis maybe shouldn't be the way forward, because of the risk then of increasing the amount of worming drug on the land and potentially increasing the resistance within the worming population. So what's the future for worming in horses? Well, it's something we've got to be very mindful about, really, because there aren't any new drugs on the horizon for horses. There are certain blood samples that have been tested and developed for testing what sort of worms your horse has, and then we don't have to rely on fecal egg counts. And certainly this is important for some of the more difficult to find ones, and things like liver fluke come into that, even the cytostomins would come into that. There is a saliva test now which looks quite promising, although there's been no independent verification of it yet. But these are the sorts of things that we need to look out for, and certainly the management of our worm control has got to take a lot more importance, and more so than just using worming drugs. So in summary, the advice I should really concentrate on is you should get your veterinary advice. That is such an important part of it, on the timing of your worming and the type of worming that you have to use, because worming drugs are an essential part of the worm control. But as well as that, you must concentrate also on the worm management technique. So we're talking about taking fecal egg counts, we're talking about not having too great a stocking density, we're talking about grazing your horses with other species, things like cattle, sheep and goats, that type of thing. And obviously one of the most time-consuming things like poo picking, which ideally if you do it once or twice a week will help to reduce the worm burden on your pasture. All these things are quite important, and particularly with young horses. Adult horses are equally important, certainly some of them, but the young horses are very, very important, and you must be on the game with that, really. So I hope you've enjoyed the video, I hope it's been useful, and thanks for your attention. Enjoy your horses.